Hello to everyone. As already I am introduced by Dr. Pramod Jaishwal. First, let me thank to the Nepali Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for organizing such a fascinating event and conference, bringing all these amazing people, participants, professors, and practitioners together. Uh, just for your convenience, although my passport name is Styopa, just you can call me Stepan. This is the right name. And I don't want to waste the time we have for this wonderful panel with 5 speakers. I just will start saying that, just reminding that all panelists will have 10 minutes for their introductory remarks. And also we will have some Q&A session as in previous sessions. And I just would like to start with saying that I really enjoyed the previous panel and information we were provided by so many participants from different countries. Now, the topic of our today's session is the future of Quad and maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. And we have 5 distinguished panelists here. As Dr. Pramod already introduced them, they are Professor Geoffrey from the he is Rajaratnam Professor of Strategic Studies from Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Professor, warmly welcome you. The next will be Professor Sato Yoichiro, who is the Dean of Graduate School of Asia-Pacific Studies, Ritsumeikan Asia-Pacific University in Japan. Also, we have Professor Dr. Swaran Singh from the School of International Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. The 4th speaker will be Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell from the U.S. Department of the Air Force of the United States of America. And the final, the last but not the least speaker would be Mr. Lucas Myers, who is Senior Associate of the Indo-Pacific Pacific Program of the Wilson Center in the United States. I, again, warmly welcome all of you, expressing gratitude for this wonderful opportunity. And let me start with Professor Geoffrey. Professor, as you already know, the topic of the discussion is maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region and future of Quad. With all its ups and downs throughout last years, where we are now, and what are your introductory remarks or maybe presentation for all of us? And please, the floor is yours for your thoughts. We will be enjoying that.
Thank you very much indeed, Stefan. I hope you can hear me okay. And hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Well, Mahan may or may not have said it, but the Indian Ocean is clearly really important. It's 20% of the world's surface, has a third of the world's population around it, 40% of the world's coastline, lots of oil and gas, 100,000 ships pass through it every year. And that really is the real point, I think. It's the interconnections of the Indian Ocean with everywhere else that really matters. That is the defining characteristic of the subject that we're addressing, I think. One remembers Mackinder just before the First World War arguing that, and I quote, "the unity of the ocean is the simple physical fact underlying the dominant value of sea power in the modern globe-wide world. So that means that all the globe-wide world comes calling in the Indian Ocean, if you like. And it's clearly a very maritime area. Lots of fish, oil and gas. It's a major transport route that keeps the global sea-based trading system going. So its maritime security is critically important. Now, I think there are three components to this maritime security that we need to address. The first component of it is maritime safety. That is to say, dealing with what you might call inanimate threats. Things like navigational accidents, the effect of pandemics, climate change, that sort of thing. The second category of issues has to do with the threats to good order at sea that are posed by people and groups who mean harm. And here I chiefly have in mind criminals, terrorists, and that kind of thing. So it's people who break good order at sea by illegal fishing, by engaging in the trade in human beings and drugs trades, arms, the illegal smuggling of weapons and that kind of thing. The third category of maritime security has to do with defence. And here one is dealing with the defence of national interests against other nations, perhaps, along with other nations as well as allies and partners, but also against large-scale transnational groups of one sort or another, particularly terrorists. All three of these are on a common spectrum. They're not separate. They merge into one another. And the positions of all three on this spectrum require maritime cooperation. And that maritime cooperation needs to be as seamless as possible because the spectrum of threats is equally as seamless as possible. But getting that kind of maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean faces three immediate problems, it seems to me. The first, of course, and it's a point already made by people before, is that it is a vast area. And that means that there are all sorts of different agendas of what the priority issues really are. And because of that, the Indian Ocean is a kind of thicket of different multilateral organizations in the whole ocean, which are often under-institutionalized. In other words, they're declaratory more than institutional. And there's limited coordination between them. That's one problem. The second problem, I think, is what seafarers frequently complain about, everywhere in the world, actually, not just in the Indian Ocean, and that is insufficient governmental and societal attention paid to the importance of what happens at sea. That there is a very natural preoccupation with the thrust of immediate events on land. And that means that there's too little resources devoted to maritime security of all sorts, actually, but particularly of the first two. And then the third problem that we've already discussed in this meeting is growing great power competition. So I think that invites a very brief, and I'm conscious of the fact I'm covering a vast area in very few minutes, a very brief survey of how maritime cooperation is doing in all three aspects of that spectrum of maritime security. The first one, safety. This is largely, of course, a matter of IMO regulations. Things like the Sewer Convention, environmental issues, the SOLAS Convention, and so forth, and onwards and so forth. Problems here, of course, is that IMO regulations have less than perfect enforcement. It's up to people who sign the conventions and agree to them to actually enact them. And that means that there can be considerable lack of enforcement of those regulations. And I think you can see that in the way that people find their way around sanctions campaigns that are kind of internationally authorized of one sort or another. And there are increasing environmental and other risks to the kind of thing they get up to. In other words, the use of dark fleets and that sort of thing, which are inadequately insured, inadequately protected, and so on and so forth. And the complexity of ownership of many ships is a problem too. However, the point really, and the important issue, is that the matter of principle. If we do not observe these regulations, we are undermining the idea that at sea there are these rules that need to be obeyed. And people who get away with not obeying them for commercial reasons, for example, do actually threaten the whole system, if you like. Environmental safety is an issue as well. Despite the 2004 tsunami, not everyone has yet woken up to the challenge posed by climate change. Now, organisations like IORA are aware of the need to tighten enforcement up by increasing maritime domain awareness. It's very hard to solve a problem if you don't know you've got one. And this requires maritime cooperation, and it requires capacity building for those countries who are less well placed to do it themselves. The Quad 2 regards this as part of its remit. It's a kind of bonus to the main activity, which I'll get onto in a minute, which is its concern, let's say, for environmental security. And it sees in this a sort of trust building exercise for members of Quad, so they trust each other more, and that other people trust them more, the more they engage in this kind of thing. Good order at sea is very concerning. Many people would argue that the situation here is getting worse rather than better. There are three major problems in the Indian Ocean. The first is obviously illegal fishing. It's the fact that it's mainly Chinese that makes that politically very sensitive. But there are the same requirements for maritime cooperation and information sharing. Second issue is revival of piracy, which threatens seafarers, a very scarce and valuable commodity, I might say, and of course the security of the trade-based system. This too requires more maritime domain awareness, capacity building, legal enablement, resources, and cooperation, particularly in the information sharing area. The political but utterly pointless attacks on shipping in the Red Sea is an issue that context can make the necessary cooperation very difficult. And obviously, there is less than perfect cooperation in dealing with that. And then finally, there's defence. Now, Quad, as I said, contributes across the board to all aspects of maritime security, but I think it's in defence where it's distinctive. This isn't just containing China, but that is part of it. It's in defense of a state, and by that I mean a free and open Indo-Pacific, but it isn't aimed at any state. So what are the threats to this? Not the presence or the strength of any particular state, but its threatening behavior. It's rule breaking. It's when the observations and the rules and regulations implicit in UNCLOS are not being obeyed. That risks the free and open Indo-Pacific, if you like. If one likens the exercise to a convoy on a voyage to becoming a collective security organization, the slowest ship in the Quad seems to me to be India, because it values its strategic autonomy and its tradition of non-alignment, and thus it retains profitable links with Russia in the midst of the Ukraine war. Compared to, let's say, the United States and Australia, which are both in AUKUS, and Japan, which is getting closer and more traditional to AUKUS, particularly on Pillar 2 activities every day. So there is an issue there, it seems to me. All the same, India clearly sees China as a rival. It has trouble on the northern border. There's possible maritime answer to this, which is exploiting China's vulnerabilities in the Indian Ocean. But the main emphasis is on maritime cooperation through IONS. Multilateralize the security issue, expand the Malabar exercises, cooperate with incoming Europeans, all part of the process of opening up the Indian Ocean to the rest of the world, if you like. India is also conscious that in the Indian Ocean, it's a giant amidst dwarfs. So it does seem to me to be very sensitive to the need to multilateralize. So some of the comments in the previous session where other countries felt kind of left out of the process, I think are very interesting. But China has perfectly legitimate reasons to be an Indian Ocean region player too. Nonetheless, its naval presence and the Belt Road Initiative are seen as a threat in New Delhi, but less so, of course, with other countries in the region. So, in this kind of mixed picture, what are my prognostications for the future? I think it's going to be a bumpy few years. I see the growth of protectionism, which undermines some of the assumptions of the sea-based trading system that brings us all together. I see ultranationalism and the growth of great power and competition becoming increasingly threatening, particularly at the moment, actually. And this seems to me to unravel the necessary sense of community globally, but also in the Indian Ocean, just at the time when things like climate change and the COVID experience suggest we need that cooperation most of all. And with that, I think my 10 minutes is up.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for opening this wonderful panorama on challenges and perspectives of the Quad and its future. Now I call Professor Dr. Sato Yoichiro from Japan, from the Graduate School of Asia-Pacific Studies at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. Well, Japan is one of the initiators of this dialogue, security dialogues. What are your thoughts and what you can contribute to what Professor Geoffrey Till already observed and made as the outlines of this security platform? Dr. Yoichiro, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this very prestigious panel with many prominent speakers. Professor Till has really nicely laid out the diverse range of issues involving maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. And I would like to kind of bring us back some 20 years ago, and then maybe even further to see a kind of multilateral cooperation in maritime security broadly defined in first in the Western Pacific and then gradually evolving into the Indian Ocean region. Among the Quad members, in fact, Japan, Australia, and the US have had a longer history of cooperation. And since 2008, there has been the Trilateral Security Dialogue Framework, which was basically a 2+2 format. Defense minister and the foreign minister from 3 countries periodically get together to discuss security in general. And I recall the earlier meetings quite deliberately avoided naming China in their discussions and statements. And a lot of the focus was paid on how to jointly deal with transnational security issues. And those included the issues of maritime domain, such as maritime terrorism and the movement of the illegal migrations, illegal terrorist movements, training, and drug trafficking and piracy and so forth. And the three countries did have a really well-coordinated division of labor in that sense. Although I would say the insufficient resource has always been a problem for all of these countries compared to the scale of the problems in the region. But for example, about the terrorist movement in the Celebes Sea, Makassar Strait, the Australia and the US took a primary role in addressing this threat, whereas Japan took a leading role in the Malacca Strait piracy issues in the late 1990s. So that is really a natural extension of their respective bilateral alliances with the United States. And in Japan's case, in Southeast Asia, Japan has been very active in maritime safety cooperation, as Professor Teo pointed out. So it was easy for Japan to build on this long-established cooperation, not involving the Maritime Self-Defense Force initially, but it was Coast Guard initiatives with the Southeast Asian countries. So in many Southeast Asian countries, Japan laid the foundation of the regional coast guards, and the design of the Coast Guard was often placed under the civilian law enforcement, largely because Japan had a constitutional restriction against providing military assistance. So even the design of the Coast Guard in Southeast Asia was influenced by Japan. So if you look at the countries like Malaysia, they have the MIMA, which is a civilian ministry in charge of the Coast Guard. So the Indian involvement in Quad, in the most recent meeting, it became clear that India will take a leading role in maritime capacity building for the Indian Ocean region island countries. So this was a good development, but I think, as Professor Teo pointed out, India is a kind of latecomer in that sense. I remember in the earlier, the Coast Guard capacity building forum, the seminars organized by Japan, India was often invited participants and recipient of Japanese capacity building assistance. But now India is becoming the giver of the capacity building assistance to Indian Ocean region island states. So this is a welcome development. The effort is shifting more toward the military side as well among some of these participants, and Japan, Australia, US, plus Philippines joined the joint naval exercise in the South China Sea in the recent years. And the Philippines' relationship with these three countries are evolving in the sense of allowing more frequent presence of the military forces from these three countries onto the Philippine soil. And the access agreements have been expanded. The US can use more Filipino bases for its military operations. And Japan signed agreements to facilitate joint exercise and mutual visitations as well. So these are all new development, and in a way, Philippines is unique among the ASEAN countries. But how far this partnership will develop is yet to be seen, because the Philippines has a history of kind of oscillating whenever the president changes. So we'll see, how a rapidly evolving relationship, completely reverses in direction. And to that extent, I think we have just about witnessed similar development with South Korea. South Korea, Japan, US were heading toward a closer trilateral cooperation, and some of which did have maritime dimensions, but now everything is on hold, and if not in a reverse gear yet. So I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sato Yoichiro, for this amazing addition and perspective from Japan. Now the turn is it's turn of Dr. Swaran Singh from the School of International Studies of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. Well, our previous speakers introduced kind of national perspectives towards this future of Quad and maritime cooperation. What's India's perspective? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Also, thank you to Pramod and his very young, dynamic team at Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. And of course, it's a delight to be on a panel with Professor Geoffrey Till, with Sato Sansai, with Dr. Gunasekara, and we are discussing here the future of Quad and maritime security in Indo-Pacific region. I understand I have about 10 minutes, and I will like to use my time to flag a couple of points. Let me say, largely addressing simple issues. Why Quad? Why maritime? And of course, why India? We all understand that in the post-Cold War period, if one has to look at certain time period where the shift has started, great powers have really moved from, for example, air power has expanded into aerospace power, and naval powers have expanded to maritime power. So in that sense, the focus of the naval powers now emerging as maritime powers has shifted from naval alliances, naval bases, and so on, to much more on projections and perceptions and naval diplomacy and exercises, primarily focusing on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and so on. And that's the context in which we are looking at maritime cooperation around the world. In this case, we are looking at the Indo-Pacific region. Second question, why Quad? There are two ways possibly to look at. One, of course, is that invariably in all Quad interactions, whether they are academic or official, China remains the big elephant in the room. We all understand that from early 1990s, there was a whole global concern about overheating of China's economic growth rates. In fact, Prime Minister Churumchi was brought in for soft landing of those inordinate 13% growth rate, for example, for 1992, 1993. And by the time the world experienced tsunami in this part of the world, China was very close to becoming the second largest economy. It had already moved from about 300 billion in early 1990s to nearly 2 trillion economy by the time tsunami happened. And by 2010, this was to overtake Japan and become world's second largest economy. That economic miracle was already a matter of concern for much of the world that had anything to do with this region. But fundamentally, this had also recast the whole regional arrangements. Go back to after Second World War, creation of Southeast Asian Treaty Organization and the Baghdad Pact, later Central Treaty Organization, which became dysfunctional, and therefore United States tried to soft balance and contain spread of communism using ASEAN. Now, the same region was becoming not separate two theaters of Pacific theater and Indian Ocean theater, where Pacific Command was looking at the security of Pacific Ocean, Central Command was looking at security of Indian Ocean. China's emergence as an economic powerhouse, later, of course, emerging from 2013, world's largest trading power, was connecting this whole Indo-Pacific rim already before West decided to do something about it. So China was really the big elephant in the room. And when tsunami happened, we saw that some of these countries, Japan, Australia, India, United States, saw that their naval power could come together and coordinate a certain sense of dealing with the challenge of tsunami and working together and developing a working relationship, which developed the first sense that we need to perhaps now recast regional arrangements where China was already redefining the region. So here we saw the first imagination of whether these countries can come together. And I think the last straw on the camel's neck, as we say in some of our societies, was the fact of East Asian financial crisis that saw China becoming the first one to come and help some of these nations. So therefore, ASEAN, that was created to contain communism, gradually became a great friend of China. Today, $500 billion plus of trade, enormous investments, Belt and Road Initiative. So ASEAN, which was the only pillar of ensuring US-centric architecture, was now becoming redundant because Sato alliances were dysfunctional from 50s, 60s onwards. Soft balancing was being done through ASEAN. Now ASEAN was seen on the driving seat as the center of entire regional architecture, with an assumption that ASEAN will never take any decision that will harm or hurt the core interests of any major powers. Now, by this time, China, which was really outcast in initial decades, had become the center stage, had become a major power, and now ASEAN was tilting, gradually becoming closer to China. That means the original imagination of ASEAN being on the driving seat was becoming less effective, almost irrelevant. That is why Quad seeks to recast the regional architecture by bringing in the major powers, where ASEAN is no longer seen as effective. It's good for dialogue, good for talking shop. It's not enough to counter influence of China. In fact, 4 of these countries have their problems in South China Sea, but ASEAN has never stood collectively to challenge China on those issues. Chinese claims are coming almost to the coastlines of some of these countries, all the way from Chinese coastlines. But ASEAN is redundant in that sense in really soft balancing China. It can be good forum for discussion. Therefore, Quad. Answer is why Quad? Therefore, Quad. Quad wanted to bring in India. Why India is the second question? Because Australia is an ANZUS ally of United States, largely focused on Western Pacific. And when it wanted to look west, it was becoming soft on China. Japan had no naval power in major. They do have a smart self-defense navy, but it's problem of under 1% budget. It was not seen. It was at best working for logistical support. And you had a large, powerful Indian navy. And therefore, if you have to create a new arrangement, a new architecture of major powers coming together to restrain China, control China, whatever language you want to use it, India had to be part of it. And I do want to draw your attention very quickly. I have about 3 or 4 minutes left. to what Sato Sensei said. I heard him say, and he's a good friend, India is a latecomer. It depends on how do you see India as a latecomer. India had enormous cultural and commercial engagement with entire littoral from the 4th century. There are archaeological records, there are written documents records, there are folklore. 4th century onwards, India was totally engaged with large part of this region. It reached its peak around the 10th century during Chola Empire. And of course, Indian language, Indian epics, Indian people, whether it is Champa Empire in Vietnam or Angkor Wat and so on. I mean, I need not spend my time on this right now. It depends on how do you see India as a latecomer. And therefore, I think India's credentials very appropriately, aptly were appreciated, and India became part of Quad. Now, India is saying 2-3 things. I think if any of you have interest, and I'm sure you know, 2 simple things to understand India's approach to Quad. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's speech at Shangri-La Dialogue on 1st June of 2018, and then second speech by our erudite Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar in Chulalongkorn University in August of 2022. Quickest way to understand India's approach. 2 things India has always said: India would never like to see this region or the arrangements in this region becoming militarized. Second, India would never like to see any arrangement becoming exclusive club of any of these nations. So first, during Trump's first period, we saw Mike Pompeo's speeches. There was a whole angst, anxiety in China of Quad becoming Asian NATO. I think India was the only country that withstood all the pressures that we will not like to see any conventional military discussions coming on the platform of Quad. So farthest it goes is to cybersecurity, non-traditional security. Otherwise, it talks of critical technologies, pandemics, and so on. So in that sense, India has stood up and stayed as a member of Quad on its own terms. And therefore, in September of 2021, President Biden had to create AUKUS. If you want to hard balance China using naval power, create another forum. So AUKUS was created, and therefore India is really being increasingly recognized. As Sato Sensei also said, India is being recognized for its maritime prowess, maritime influence. And I think very quick last point here, I think I have just 1 minute left. There is a discussion on Quad Plus and Quad Plus Plus. When we talk of future of Quad, India is very much in support of adding more nations who are willing and who can bring in some positive energy into Quad. South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand are already seen. The defense secretary of US during the Trump era was already talking to these 3 during pandemic period. Particularly the role of Quad in pandemic is very interesting. So I hear some of the academic voices. I was recently in South Korea where academics are talking about South Korea joining Quad. In fact, also South Korea joining BRICS. It's very interesting. So India would be very happy to see the future of Quad becoming more inclusive, not just bringing in Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand, but possibly also bringing in other stakeholders. And we have seen one after another countries have issued their Indo-Pacific strategies, policy papers, and so on. And I think the future of Quad is going to come into action again with President Trump coming to power from 20th of January. We saw that the very foundations of Quad being institutionalized began during Trump era, during his first presidential term, when senior joint secretary level conversations began. Then it went to vice ministers, it reached foreign ministers. Of course, summit meetings began during President Biden's period. Clearly, Trump coming back to White House will show the United States again taking greater interest in Quad. And I believe Quad is going to become once again fairly an active forum. And the fact that India is hosting the next summit very soon now will also mean the President Donald Trump's first foreign visit might happen to India to attend the Quad summit, which India will be hosting. So we are all looking forward to Quad in coming times, in short term at least, getting activated, revived, and becoming much more energetic. And of course, we will see how each of these countries work on that. But there is a fundamental drift that is happening in terms of ASEAN still getting the lip service of being, at the center of entire region, being on the driving seat. ASEAN-centric approach is still very valid in terms of dialogue and conversations, but balancing of China is already drifting and has already drifted to Quad being at the center stage. And I think we all understand that we need to watch that. Thank you. And back to Stefan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for sharing the Indian perspective on the future of Quad and making that perspective very clear, especially when we have the transition of presidencies in the United States, where our last two speakers are coming from. And I think our distinguished panelists are quite challenged by many observations regarding to non-militarization of this security platform and security architecture, regarding to some expectations from the Trump administration, and take into account that Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell is from the United States Department of the Air Forces. Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell, please react and make your introductory remarks on what was said by our distinguished panelists, or maybe your very different perspective on the future and maritime security within Quad format. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. First, I want to thank Dr. Jaiswal and the NICE conference team for the invitation to present. Before I get going, though, of course, as a government employee, I have to mention that the views and opinions that I'm going to express are solely mine and are not reflective of those of the Department of Defense or other agencies of the departments of the U.S. government. That'll probably be pretty obvious pretty soon, but it's both a privilege and a purpose that we gather today to talk about these kinds of things. As our previous speaker, Dr. Singh, mentioned, Trump was instrumental, along with Modi and previous leaders of Australia and Japan, in rebooting Quad into what it is today. And I do think that he's spot on that we will see that become an increasing focus of American foreign policy in the new administration. They're going to. But again, one of the things that I think that we will see is, an enhanced push for more military engagement and presence from the Trump administration. I think the expansion of Malabar exercise has shown that it's basically turned into sort of a Quad exercise in some extent, hosted by India. I think that there will be some push for this to be augmented in both scale and scope, bolstering not just operational readiness, but also symbolic unity, and kind of a push then too for interoperability. Now, obviously, that's going to be stymied a little bit by the fact that India continues to acquire Russian military systems, which makes it difficult for interoperability amongst systems, but not necessarily amongst personnel. The operational sinews of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command will be strengthened to demonstrate unmistakably that the United States is not merely an observer, but also an indispensable participant in the region's security architecture. I think there'll be more push for expansion, not just of Quad into the Quad Plus, which, again, did take a lot more impetus during the first Trump administration than it seems to have in the Biden administration. And, even to the point where we had, people from as far afield as Brazil attending, Quad Plus type meetings. It'll be interesting to see who the players are now that there's been, a considerable shakeup of leadership around the globe. Some of which may not be, for example, in the case of Brazil, that inclined to engage in Quad Plus. The other thing is there's a little bit of concern about the stability of the governments in Japan and Australia right now too. With the Yeshiva government being a minority government, it's kind of walking on eggshells right now. So it'll be interesting to see, if if there's a change of government in Japan, what the tack of the new government might be there. Albanese has suffered a lot of loss of credibility with the Australian electorate, and they've got an election coming up just next year, I believe in May at the latest. So we could see again a shakeup in leadership there. But with the Australians, at least, you have seen, like with the United States, a continuity of commitment to AUKUS and to Quad, despite the differences in domestic politics there. So I don't think that if there is a shift of change in government there, that is going to have perhaps the same impact that a shift in Japan might have. And Sato-san can definitely speak better to that than I can in the context of Japan. Returning to U.S. policy, though, I do think there'll be a greater impetus put on economic statecraft and infrastructure investments. The Trump administration, for example, in the his first term, started the Blue Dot Network, which kind of got rebranded into the Build Back Better and all the other little crazy acronyms that we have to repackage everything, IPEF and whatnot, under the Biden administration. I think those will be enhanced then to try to counterbalance the Belt and Road Initiative and to try to regain some of the ground that we've lost to the Chinese in terms of offering assistance to would-be allies and partners in the region. There's also going to be a stronger push then for technological and cybersecurity cooperation, and a lot of that will feed into the Pillar 2 of AUKUS and into other initiatives that are already underway with Quad. There'll be efforts to try to safeguard the 5G and SG frontiers, redefining the promises and the challenges that are presented by artificial intelligence, and how those how our allies and partners in the region can help us and we them in creating policies and international rules as to how those are defined. But one of the main things that is both a cause for concern and somewhat domestically delight among certain people here is the Trump proclivity for tariffs. It definitely will be significantly targeted towards China. But there's been talk too of perhaps tariffs against even India. And this then kind of would serve to curtail to some extent the ability for the administration to strengthen the Quad if we start slapping tariffs on our would-be allies and partners. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how that plays out, and whether speaking about tariffs might be enough to alter some of the trade negotiations and stuff that are out there to the point where we don't actually have to execute them. But that will remain to be seen. In terms of maritime security dynamics, we have to really understand then the evolving threatscape that's out there in terms of regional adversaries and their proclivity for gray zone warfare, and also non-state aggression or non-state actors that are engaged in the region. I believe Dr. Thiel and Sato-san both spoke about that. And so we've got to really come up with some decent countermeasures for that sort of thing. We've got some interesting characters that, I probably don't have time to talk about right now, but as we proceed into the discussion, I want to come back to talk about, what we can expect from Rubio as Secretary of State, and kind of talk about how America First doesn't necessarily mean exactly the kind of ultra nationalism that gives Dr. Thiel reason for concern. That you can be a nationalist, and I think Modi has shown this as well. You can be a nationalist without necessarily, pushing your friends away. They're not mutually exclusive. They can be, but they don't have to be. And I think that if you look at the team that he's surrounding himself with in this term, I don't think that it will be. I think the one concern that I do have is that the domestic developments that are going to be at the forefront of the first year at least of the new Trump administration might distract him and his team from paying the attention that's needed in the Indo-Pacific, both to Quad, maritime security, and other issues. When we talk about trying to shore up our southern border, talking about deporting illegal immigrants and that sort of thing, that's going to take up an inordinate amount of attention. There's going to be a lot of domestic unrest here in relation to that, and that might then sideline our efforts to really, make that transition to the Indo-Pacific that all the administrations in the last, a decade and a half have been talking about. Will we finally make the pivot to the Indo-Pacific? And we can hope that that's the case, but that remains to be seen. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we make our second round. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell, for this interesting introductory remark. And our last speaker, but not the least one, is Mr. Lucas Myers from the Wilson Center of the United States of America. So again, coming back to the question, especially when we will have Trump administration in Washington very soon next year. And this is one of the uncertainties for the world, not only for Quad or maritime security and the fields of cooperation, inclusiveness of the platform. However, his administration is well known by many experts, scholars, as someone who challenged multilateralism. But Quad is on multilateral cooperation. So is there any contradiction between this platform? The interest of Trump administration in 2017 was quite obvious in Quad. So what to expect, and whether multilateralism will be challenged, as our previous speaker just stressed, what the America First will mean for others, for this security architecture as well. Mr. Lucas Myers, the floor is yours, please. You have 10 minutes as others. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And thank you to the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for this invitation. I'm pleased to be here. As the distinguished panelists already discussed, the Quad is certainly an important aspect in the Pacific maritime cooperation. But I'll say that I have a nuanced view on the Quad these days. So one, I think it stands fairly strong. We're coming off of the fourth Leaders Summit this year, held in Delaware in the United States. In the seventh year since this revived Quad 2.0 first met on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit in 2017 under the first Trump administration. But in Washington, the Quad has its share of critics, and this is maybe because it's somewhat amorphous these days. Obviously, it started as a very firmly maritime security oriented organization, right? The response to the Indian Ocean tsunami, the four countries coming together to conduct humanitarian assistance, disaster relief efforts there. But at the end of the day now, all of a sudden, we're looking at the Quad covering cybersecurity, climate issues, infrastructure, fellowships, a wide variety of things. And many in Washington, that I've talked to and around the world have actually called it a bit into question, sort of saying, well, has its traditional security component been drowned out? Is it too cautious about China? You'll notice that in the statement coming out of the Delaware Summit, actually ahead of the statement, some folks at the White House had said that basically, this will be the strongest statement yet on China. But then the statement comes out, and it was, in my view, not that out of sync from previous statements from the Quad. There had been clearly some discussion behind the scenes and some moderation of that language. And so again, there's its fair share of critics. But I guess what I'll do today is I'll put it in perspective and argue what I see is the value add and why I think we're in a good position to see the Quad move forward and why this non-traditional security approach that it's adopted in its second iteration makes sense, but could evolve. So as I'll say, what's interesting is in the last year I've been I participated in a State Department funded program that basically sent think tankers all around all four Quad countries to have discussions and talk. And one thing that was always interesting is the official line from the foreign ministries was basically Quad's always been about public goods. It's not about security. It's not about China. Obviously, though, that's the official line, but there's a lot more complexity to it. I think what's interesting, especially now, is since its new iteration, you see this public goods element start coming forward much more prominently than the security side. For instance, you'll notice that the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue name itself is no longer anything official. It's actually just the Quad. There's not really, the security element is very explicitly downplayed. From my understanding, this is, sort of concern in New Delhi and Canberra under the Albanese government about overly securitizing the arrangement and potentially alienating countries in the global south, specifically Southeast Asia. You hear a lot of criticism in ASEAN about the Quad, and I think there's some concern there. But generally, it's interesting that now the Quad is sort of putting itself forward as, oh, we do public goods. We're going to be this alternative. You'll see in the language from the statements, the deliverables, that what they're saying is okay, we're going to be this force for good. We're going to provide stability and prosperity, a free and open Indo-Pacific. The unstated alternative being, we're countering China's offerings, right? So it's always this very strange position where it comes together out of maritime security, but now the security component is downplayed. It's putting forth more of a public goods agenda, but then you could also criticize it by saying that this public goods agenda is somewhat limited in ambition. The money that's been put forth is not quite the same as, say, what the G7 does. The Indo-Pacific is already well endowed with quite a few security arrangements. Recently, one of the other panelists mentioned the squad that the Philippines, Australia, Japan, and the US have put forward that's much more traditional security focused, talking about South China Sea, joint naval exercises. The Quad does not have a defense ministers meeting yet. It's at the foreign minister and leaders level. The last statement mentioned that the commerce and industry cabinet level positions will have a meeting in the future, but again, it's still very much shying away from security. But what's interesting now is with President Trump coming back into office, obviously Quad 2.0 started again under his watch in 2017. And what I would expect in 2025 and moving forward is that there'll be more of a push from the US side to bring out some of this maritime security element, ramp up the cooperation on that side. You already see some of that happening. I mean, in the last Quad summit, they announced this Coast Guard rider program between the 4 Quad countries. Obviously, there's always been a maritime security component, but moving more towards the naval side, I wouldn't be surprised to see some effort to do that. But again, I think there'll be pushback from specifically India and Australia about concerns about securitizing Quad and making it too overtly about China. Because there's always this balancing act. And I think that's, to me, the fundamental tension in the Quad is that on one hand, you have it's obvious that it's about China and that what brings all 4 countries together is this strategic alignment that China is the biggest threat to a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And all 4 of us need to get together and cooperate to prevent any further damage. But on the other end, there's also the countervailing view that, well, if we're too overtly about China, it'll alienate countries in ASEAN. It'll, cause problems in our domestic relationships. I mean, what killed the first iteration of the Quad was China's, push against the Australian government of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And then that led them to sort of withdraw in 2008, and so really what you're looking at is this tension here, and how you balance that, I think, is going to be a big challenge for the Quad going forward. Especially now that I would anticipate the Trump administration will be much more keen on pushing competition with China. But really what I would say is that fundamentally, I think the Quad is in a good place. Even if it has these challenges, even if it's a bit amorphous, I think the underlying strategic alignment is so strong and firm that regardless of leadership transition, right? You look at Japan, Australia, the US, there's a lot of potential change here. But at the end of the day, I think the general trend in all 4 capitals is that this is a good thing. And this is from folks I've talked to across the region and all these capitals. And finally, I think just talking about inclusivity and some of the challenge there, I actually think that right now, keeping it a Quad and not making it a quintuple or something, right? It's sort of makes more sense to have it to the fore. And I think that comes back to the strategic alignment question. Under, now the, outgoing President Yoon in South Korea, there was some talk about, South Korea in the Quad. But I think the challenge there is that fundamentally South Korea, as an example, does not 100% have this strategic alignment about the China threat. It's in a much more sort of hedged position vis-a-vis China. And whereas I think Australia, India, Japan, the US are much more firm that China is essentially in a rivalry and is a threat to this order. Whereas I think many other countries that have specific issues that they would like to cooperate with the Quad on, such as South Korea, Vietnam, are much less strategically aligned on the China question as the other four. And I think that's why, from my perspective, it'll probably remain a Quad with a formal membership of four. But then on the Quad Plus side, I think it's very open and interested to expand its cooperation on maritime issues, climate, disease, pandemic response, all these other issues that it's sort of brought under its remit. But really, I think, I'm positive. Obviously it has its challenges and it has its critics, but I think going forward, the interest is there.
Thank you very much, Lucas Meyers, Senior Associate from the Indo-Pacific Program of Woodrow Wilson Center. Honorable gentlemen, ladies, among participants, we have 1 hour left for Q&A and exchange, interventions, etc., etc. But before opening the floor for Q&A, I call you if you have some reaction to or remarks on these statements made by panelists. So feel free to do that. Then I will open the Q&A session a bit later. You know that the software of Zoom provides this opportunity to raise hands. Please do that. And we will give the floor to you. Any intention or desire, make a statement or react to these statements?
Yeah, I just want to briefly respond to Professor Singh's point that historically India has been a very prominent actor in the Indian Ocean region. I totally agree with you. And in fact, I think the human connections India has left throughout the Indian Ocean region is going to be very instrumental when we try to jointly counter the influence of Chinese Belt and Road initiatives throughout the African East Coast, for example, and try to bring in some alternative infrastructure assistance based on quality and economic feasibility rather than the desire to politically take over the governance of particular countries. So I think Japan doesn't have that kind of human networks, whereas India does. So I think both countries should work together about the East African littoral states development issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sato Yoichiro. Any other intervention or remark by panelists? If not, then I'm opening the Q&A session and calling all the participants to be very active. You have two options, either to raise your hand or just to write your questions in chat box. So I will read them and address them to others. And before having the first question, let me start with Professor Geoffrey Teal. You classified all the major challenges into three groups, and the second one was competition between great powers in the region. So can you elaborate a little bit more? What are your assessment on the projection of this great powers competition on the maritime security may look like? And having all these different positionings and different perspectives by the member countries, Japan, India, and others, on the future of the security the architecture of the Quad, can you tell us how the recent developments, be they in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, be them in Middle East, Syria, or in Korean Peninsula, in South Korea, how they may impact on this great powers competition in the region, and in particular on the maritime security and cooperation on it. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, yes, indeed. That's a very interesting and important question. It does seem to me to justify me underlining the point that I think there are these three positions in maritime security, and they are all on the same spectrum. And what we're seeing emerge, I think, in the course of what my prestigious colleagues have just been talking about, is that there is a certain amount of tension between them, in the sense that India, perhaps the current Australian government as well, are more reluctant to think about the securitization project for the Quad than the other two are. And so there's a kind of tension between emphasizing the original thrust of the Quad, which was on maritime security at the first and second rather than the third, safety and good order at sea, than on the defense side of things, if you like. Whereas under the Trump administration, we might well see a reanimation of the American preference and the Japanese preference too, I would think, for much more of an emphasis in the Quad on the defense side of things. Now, this is very interesting because maritime security has two different justifications. Maritime security at the lower end, I mean, safety and good order at sea. The first one is intrinsic. In other words, some of the things that are required to be done are really critical for their own sake, like the protection of merchant shipping, like preventing things like what's happening in the Red Sea at the moment, like, for example, preventing or at least lowering the extent to which the merchant shipping industry itself is contributing to the climate crisis and things of that sort. The second justification for it is that engaging in this kind of thing is a trust-building exercise. It does actually build trust. The more you cooperate with other countries on things that are not seen as controversial, the more trust you slowly develop. And that is not just trust between the members of the Quad, it's between the members of the Quad as an institution, and everybody else in the Indian Ocean area. So in other words, it can be seen as a way to maritime cooperation at a higher level, the higher defense level of maritime cooperation, if you like. And it seems to me that that kind of long-term scenario was actually always there at the beginning of the project back in 2004 and so on, not least because China was often identified as one of the biggest challenges through its the huge number of illegal fishing boats that it conducts in the Indian Ocean area. So it doesn't surprise me that there is a debate within Quad about the speed with which this trajectory towards the Quad becoming more securitized is actually a controversial issue. But it is a controversial issue, and I think we have to accept that fact. You asked specifically about how current circumstances, the Ukraine war, what's happening in the Middle East and so on, might affect all of this. Well, I think what's happening particularly in the Ukraine, but also to a degree in the Middle East, is a kind of indication that whether we like it or not, the world as a whole is getting more concerned about great power competition. And this is becoming more of an issue, not less. And so I think this is going to strengthen the conception that what we're likely to see in the Quad is an acceleration in what I think has always been a slow trajectory towards the Quad becoming more securitized, whatever the early doubts of other countries. And I think one can see that in little details. Like, for example, that the recent Malabar exercises did not emphasize things like dealing with illegal fishermen or anything of that sort. They were primarily ASW exercises, anti-submarine warfare, anti-air warfare, this kind of thing that is fundamentally characteristic of the third last highest, most high intensity level of maritime security. So I think the fact that what's happening in the Ukraine is going to encourage that trajectory. But having said that, there is the fact that over the Ukraine, for example, India has pursued, and so has Vietnam, has pursued its connections with Russia, despite the sanctions campaign and so on and so forth. In justifying it with its sort of traditional emphasis on basically non-alignment and being against organizations like this impeding its strategic autonomy. So I think that is going to be a continuing trend. But this, if you like, it seems to me to be India's issue rather than the Quad's issue. Where is Indian foreign policy likely to go over the next few years? And it seems to me that other members of the panel are in a much better position than I am to actually speculate about where that might be. But unless India does, if you like, sign up to more securitization, I do see more friction with a sort of Trumpian administration's thrust for, as both the American speakers have said, towards it becoming more of a security project, if you like. So I see more problems there, in other words, unless India shifts a bit in its policy.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think Professor Swaran Singh already has a question asked by Professor Thiel. But before giving the floor to you, I will just voice the question in our chat box by Kentaro Furuya. Professor Thiel and Sato mentioned the threats in the region and capacity building in the regional Coast Guard agencies. What do you think is the most necessary training or education to maintain the rule-based international order? So, sir, you both have this question, Professor Thiel and Professor Yoichiro Sato. Please, go ahead.
Should I start? I think it's a very interesting question. Let me specify and reinforce the point, underline the point that I do not see an interest in maritime security at the lower levels of intensity as being a bipolar choice. It seems to me that the Quad strength is that it can do all three levels. It's just a question of the balance that it strikes between them. Having said that, let me answer the question. I think the most critical issue confronting maritime security at the first and second level is maritime domain awareness. As I think I said during my talk, it's very difficult to solve a problem if you don't know you've got one. And the sea is so vast, the agility of the maritime criminal is so high to deceive and spoof and hide the levels of activity. They have every incentive to develop new ways of confusing and deceiving the forces of good, if you like. So maritime domain awareness is absolutely critical. And there's no two ways about it. There are very different levels of capability in the Indian Ocean area and indeed the whole of the Indo-Pacific. So filling up the gaps, if you like, that there are from those countries that can actually afford to do that does seem to me to be extremely important. And that's not just the provision of equipment, that's also the provision of training, the use of the equipment, and most particularly the maintenance of the equipment. Because if there is historically been a problem, it's been the maintenance of actually what has been donated, if you like. So that's one aspect of the thing that I would really emphasize. Maritime domain awareness, the resources to do it with in terms of patrol aircraft, patrol boats and this kind of thing, training. And then the second one, of course, is information sharing. I do worry that there's been a sort of growth of declaratory interest in setting up information sharing systems and centers, as though as a kind of virtue statement. Look, we've got one of these, we're doing our bit. The important thing is to make sure that that information is actually shared and that the first thrust of it is not the collection of information, but its dissemination. And so there is an urgent necessity to make sure that information centers share information between themselves and don't regard it as a kind of preserve that they want to defend, if you like, against other information sharing centers. Information is one thing, intelligence, in other words, processed information is another, and that's what we really need. So that's another area in which capacity building really needs to develop. So I think at this point, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Professor. Your answer, Professor Yoichiro, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think Professor Theo has laid out really important issues, and particularly the issue of equipment maintenance is something I really witnessed in Tonga when I conducted the field research there. And whatever's being donated there, once it breaks, it has to be brought back to Australia for repairing. And there was literally no local talent to repair anything from board to electronics. And so that was really a challenge in that sense, because if you want the local capacity in all of those things, then you really need to undertake the whole national development. And that's probably beyond what other countries can do. And perhaps, the certain technology which is more friendly to developing countries can be selectively applied and brought into the training. And I think the developed countries need to be very open to new ideas rather than trying to export their models of capacity building. Having said that, I looked at the different angles of national capacity, and oftentimes, when Mr. Furuya is very much aware of the Coast Guard, Japanese Coast Guard assistance and the JICA programs to develop capability of the island state nations in the Indian Ocean and elsewhere. And I did also take part in the JICA Coast Guard programs as an instructor of some of the modules. So I have rough idea of what's being taught in the Japanese program. But what I think is absolutely necessary is the capability of not just the Coast Guard personnel. I think we are doing that. But what's often missing is capability at the political leadership level. And they oftentimes don't fully understand the implication of taking Chinese loans, for example. And I think it's very important to bring in the political leadership into this kind of legal, international legal and diplomatic issues training, and equally offer that to opposition party members and media as well. I think Philippine media is getting really trained well to help their national policy toward the South China Sea, because they have been very successful in showing to the world what China has been doing against the Philippines' possessions in the South China Sea. So the media is a very important part of the training. And also, in the case of small island states, their diplomatic capability is extremely limited. I have had several students from South Pacific Island states, foreign ministry, and their ministry have only like 4 people working in the ministry, covering, all important partners. And it really helps them to, increase the level of their comprehension about important maritime issues, and particularly their standings and, how they can develop international cooperation to safeguard their maritime interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. Now it's your turn to
Thank
react
you.
to what...
Thank you, Stefan. I noticed Geoffrey mentioning possibility, maybe anticipation of India's drift, understandably towards the right side. I think to some extent, last 2.5 years of Ukraine crisis, almost 3 years of Ukraine crisis, have seen this becoming almost near universal anticipation of India's course correction. Trust me, Russians are as much inclined or determined to hope India's course correction, tilting towards Moscow, just like United States would like to see India also standing by the narration that comes from Washington, D.C. And that's an ongoing, constant issue that Indian foreign policy has tried to handle. And I think there is, over a period of time, also increasing recognition and perhaps understanding of the fact that India would not be in position simply because of its civilizational DNA, of whether you used to call it non-alignment, which means staying out of military alliances of either Eastern Bloc or Western Bloc, or it is more recently the new nomenclature of multi-alignment, which means building economic and developmental partnership in as many sectors with as many countries as possible. So a good example often I give is the one of Middle East, or as we call West Asia. where India is a very good partner with Iran, but also with Israel. It's a very good partner with Saudi Arabia, but also with UAE and Egypt and so on, countries that very often don't see eye to eye with each other. See India as a developmental partner. And I think that also explains how United States, when they wanted to create a second Quad for the Middle East or West Asia, they chose Israel, UAE, US, and India. So in that sense, what I'm underlining here is how increasingly the major powers' foreign policies are going to be guided by transactional nature of relationships. And a good example again is three things that happened that came out of the fact that India has stood with Russia in terms of expanding its economic relationship, not condemning Russia. Number one, the crude oil imports of India from Russia has made the bilateral trade in last 3 years go up from 8 billion to 67 billion US dollars per year. And that, of course, is a transformation which is driven primarily, as India keeps saying, to meet India's essential needs, because India is the second largest importer of crude oil. And if India can get it at a price which suits India, then there is no reason why India should not avail that opportunity. Second spin-off and outcome of this has been the advantage that many European countries have had. India is very good in refining crude oil, and Europeans who are not in position or do not desire to buy directly crude oil from Russia are buying it through India after it is refined in India, and they are in Europe happy to buy it from India. So in that sense, transactional relationship is useful to European nations who otherwise are part of all these sanctions campaign against Russia. Third point, I think, is also interesting to see if India had boycotted buying any oil from Russia, it would have created, turmoil and price hikes in crude oil prices around the world. We have already seen Ukraine crisis leading to all kinds of challenges of lack of availability of food, fuel, fertilizer, and finance. And in India's neighborhood, we sometimes relate, collapse in Sri Lanka, collapse in Pakistan, driven partly by those deficits and price hikes. So in that sense, India has contributed to bringing stability to oil prices around the world. And final very quick point, something that United States would love to do is to make sure that the no-limit relationship of President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin can somehow come to an end, that US can cast a wedge between their increasingly no-limits relationship. And India, by standing next to Russia in that sense, reasserting that time-tested relationship, has ensured that President Putin did not feel extremely alienated and vulnerable to, build still stronger relationship with President Xi Jinping. He sees there are other countries who can and are willing to engage him in that sense. So there are multiple ways in how India's engagement with Russia has benefited United States national interests as well. We all know now that the Trump team is trying its best to invite President Xi Jinping for the inauguration. Of course, most likely it's not going to happen. I hope President Trump doesn't see it as a snub from Chinese leader in that sense. I'm sure they'll continue to deal with each other. We all talk of their geopolitical contestations. At the same time, they have a bilateral trade of about $700 billion. They just recently have renewed their science cooperation agreement, which had lapsed in August. So US and China are working all the time together. So the point I'm making is that when United States makes a great partnership with Israel and Saudi Arabia, which are in contradistinction with each other, we don't question that. It's perfectly normal for United States to pursue its national interest. But when India wishes to, ensure that it doesn't hold its relationship with Russia as a hostage to relationship with the United States, sometimes there is an anticipation that India should fall in line, which of course is an issue, which is an ongoing issue. India has tried to explain its position again and again and again. I assume there is a greater recognition, acceptance of what India is doing. And, let me also remind you, as President Trump takes power from 20th of January, as the world is bracing to deal with that reality, I want to remind my colleagues here that if you remember the first term of President Donald Trump, among very, very, very few leaders who did not have problems with President Donald Trump, Indian Prime Minister was one of those exceptions in that sense. So they've had good relationship. I'm sure we saw all foundational agreements being signed during first term of President Trump, making it possible that American most advanced technologies could be transferred to India, something that US does only with its very close allies. And so I think there is a possibility of, yes, some challenges coming India's way. And of course, India will deal with those challenges. But I think in last 3 years or 4 years, India has made it more than clear that India would engage with all relationships, including relationships in Quad, where I'm not saying India has stopped thinking about conventional military issues. So yes, in Malabar, once in 24 years, you can have a focus for 1 year on conventional security threats and then focus on anti-submarine kind of exercises. I'm not saying that's not possible, but that's no longer the priority. That's what I'm underlining. So when India engages in Quad, it has so far made sure that conventional, traditional military focus is not something India wants to encourage in Quad. I'm also not saying that that cannot happen in coming years. So far, India has withstood that pressure and made sure that it is able to have its say in those Quad meetings, and all the working groups that we have in Quad at best go to the non-traditional security areas. And yes, India is conscious. In fact, Japan and Sato Sensei mentioned about how India and Japan are working on Asia-Africa growth corridor. Japan and India are the largest and most powerful economies of China's neighbors. Japan is third largest, India is fifth largest, likely to become third largest, as we are saying, in a couple of years. And we have actual physical territorial problems with China. So in that sense, these two countries have a very different take. And that's why Japan has $300 billion plus investments in China. India has $138 billion of annual trade with China. At the same time, while having tensions with China. So approach of immediate neighbors like Japan and India on China, how to contain, control, ensure China behaves within the norms, rule of law, and so on, has to be different, because US is a global superpower. And its approach and vision on how it will deal with the world definitely will be different than the vision and approach of countries like India and Japan, except that India would like to make sure that it engages on its own terms in that sense. And that is possible because India obviously is not an alliance partner of United States, which again brings in certain limitations and leverages of its own. And therefore, I think you will see that India would continue to speak the same language that India has done in the last 10 years. But that doesn't leave out possibility of revisiting and reviving and changing our stance. If structural reality around the region changes, maybe there will be some possibility of improvisations. But there's a fundamental take that India has of non-militarization of region, and ensuring that regional arrangements do not become exclusive club. And therefore focus on, in 21st century, on building networks and groupings, not 20th century organizations with a secretariat, membership, convention, constitution, and so on, which make us really prisoners of our outdated imaginations post-World War II. Networks and groupings will allow us to be constantly innovative and evolve our equations to constantly make them representative and therefore effective. And that's what is happening to Quad, where Quad is engaging with countries who potentially could become dialogue partners, observers, visitors, special invitees, whatever you want to call them. So flexibility and innovation is something which is going to be guiding the way world connects with each other in coming times. And so will be regional arrangements, architecture in the Indo-Pacific. And India seems to be very tuned in for flexibility and innovation. That's fundamentally what I'm underlining. which of course leaves the door open for improvements in coming times.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. You have one more question by Dr. Pramod Jaishwal from the Nepali Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, but I will give the floor right now to Mr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell, because the second question goes to him. And the question asked by Dr. Jaishwal is the following: what is the future of Quad in Trump 2.0? I mean, what to expect, at least having this complex picture that our participant and panelists introduced, what we can expect, what is the future of Quad?
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one. I would say, it's a highly dependent future, right? So if you look at the people that Trump is surrounding himself with, whether it be Marco Rubio at State, Pete Hegseth at Defense, Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, or Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence, they all seem to be rather hawkish, and one would assume kind of push then for a greater securitization of the Quad and other relations in the Indo-Pacific, and just having heard from Dr. Singh and others that that could prove problematic, right? You could get some pushback from India and to some degree from Australia on that, in terms of not wanting to anger Beijing, or running afoul of the longstanding non-alignment, strategic autonomy of India. But we do again have that close relationship, that close personal and political relationship between Trump and Prime Minister Modi that could perhaps overcome some of that animosity towards securitization. And one of the reasons why we've seen India too, I think, moving or maintaining that close relationship with Russia throughout the last 3.5 years, especially, has been the U.S. failure in Afghanistan. We burnt our Indian friends with the way that we pulled out, left them, having invested heavily in the rebuilding of a democratic Afghanistan that we left in tatters. And it really, I think, damaged the U.S. brand. It damaged our strategic messaging, and it called into question whether you can count on us in a time of need. And I do think then that would have injected more concern in New Delhi that they really needed to re-up then on that non-alignment strategic autonomy when facing potentially 8 years of a Biden administration that wasn't necessarily that reliable in terms of having their back if things were to go afoul again in something like a Galwan sort of incident. I would say that having that relationship, India maintaining those close ties with Russia, is problematic for us. It is breaking the sanctions that we've tried to, with the other Western powers, to enforce on Russia. Russia being close to China, then it's kind of counterproductive from our perspective, not just for us, but also for India, because China, whether they like it or not, is a strategic opponent, and helping Russia, which is becoming increasingly a lapdog of China. Yes, it might ease some of the economic tensions and make Putin feel like he doesn't have to rely as much on China, but if you look at the weaponry that's flowing into the crisis in Ukraine, the fact that that North Korean troops are moving into Ukraine would not have happened without Beijing's approval. I don't really see that the India-Russia relation is necessarily having a positive impact on Putin's thinking in terms of Ukraine or pretty much anything else as far as that goes. So it is kind of dependent then. I do see a more engaged, a more hawkish Trump administration. And then I guess the future of Quad then depends on how exactly do our partners in the Quad endeavor respond to that. So I would say it's kind of up in the air, but based on Trump 1.0 and the relations with Modi, I'm optimistic.
Thank you very much. In fact, I was going to ask you regarding to the hint by Mr. Swaran Singh, because he said that U.S. May benefit from this rapprochement between India and Russia, and this is the question which goes to back to Professor Singh. The question is asked, as I already said, by Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, and how will the growing proximity between India and Russia, coupled with the recent developments in India-China relations, aim at resolving the border standoff and influence India's Indo-Pacific strategies? So you stress that, in fact, other actors can benefit from this proximity and interplay. Please elaborate a little bit more, Professor Singh.
Thank you, Stefan. And let me first of all mention that the scope of our discussion today is primarily future of Quad. And Russia has not been so far a major issue as far as Quad is concerned. It doesn't come into its domain of concerns. Primarily when Quad meets, the main concern they have is about China. And of course, other regional issues. And I also want to underline the fact that before we moved into pandemic period, India was articulate and public about saying that India regards both China and Russia as Indo-Pacific powers. In fact, before the pandemic started, India had for 2 years on its own initiative added Indo-Pacific to the annual India-China Maritime Dialogue agenda. So India did not treat China as an outlier, as some of the other, let's say all three other Quad partners would like to see China as an outlier in the region here. In fact, for a long time, Chinese were also not mentioning Indo-Pacific. They still like to use Asia-Pacific instead. It's only November last year, not this year, that President Xi Jinping on a China-ASEAN summit meeting for the first time gave reference to ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, which is where for the first time in Xi Jinping's speech word Indo-Pacific appeared. So Chinese have also been equally kind of cautious, reluctant, skeptical about jumping into this bandwagoning with the new narrative on Indo-Pacific in that sense. Now, therefore, now the question of what India's standing together with Russia or India sustaining its relationship with Russia would mean to Quad, I think has first of all limited connect here. It's limited connect, but I understand United States is definitely much concerned, and that mindset really will be reflected in India's engagement in Quad, at least with the United States in that sense. But I also want to underline the fact that the Quad has over a period of time expanded its agenda, largely. So there are so many other issues that they have to tackle and deal with. And Russia may not still become the mainstream, even with the return of President Donald Trump and, reactivation of Quad as a kind of a forum which President Trump would like to again utilize. I understand President Trump will be extremely shy of sending troops. Sending boys to dispatch the mess, I think that is a bygone era. That kind of phraseology is no longer going to happen in coming times. At best, I think economic coercion is something that the United States would continue to do and expect its allies and partners and friends to share, burden much more along with the United States, where MAGA, Making America Great Again, is the new focus now. Now, that indeed is seen in Beijing as an opportunity. If United States wants to retreat, you remember 4 or 5 of the very important global arrangements that President Trump had walked out of during his last term in White House is something people look at. And in case he's going to continue with that kind of mindset and don't really want to take responsibility of leading the liberal world order, that creates space for emerging countries like India and a whole lot of other BRICS nations and so on to increase their kind of influence, access, or say in how international arrangements, including arrangements in Indo-Pacific, are made. And once you look at emerging economies becoming the drivers, Russia stands to gain in that, because many of these emerging economies do not see Russia exactly the way European, some of the European nations and the way United States sees Russia is not how several of these emerging economies, including India as one of those, sees Russia in that sense. So, I often now say that return of President Trump is also return of China becoming the number one concern for United States, actually bringing some relief to President Putin. President Putin may not be the number one concern anymore. China is going to come back as number one concern of United States, and that will be also reflected in deliberations inside Quad, which is where I think then, to go back to the original question, India's engagement and sustained relationship with Russia over the last 3-4 years, which is sometimes matter of concern, may actually see relatively lower attention in coming 4 years of President Trump than it has seen during the last years of President Joe Biden.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. I have one last question for Mr. Lucas Meyer, because I think it's a good opportunity to ask this after having this fascinating exchange among panelists. I remember one of the participants of the previous panel raised very, very interesting question, especially when one of panelists stressed the importance of Quad Plus and other formats, inclusiveness of this format, and so on and so on. So, but the presentation which we heard during the last panel were about benefiting from different projects, sometimes contradicting each other, like Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and so on and so on. So, and as rightly mentioned, one of the several panelists of this discussion, Trump administration perhaps will bring his concern on China. Do you see what do you see as the scenario, possible scenario to reconcile, or just to have all this to address all these issues, to have inclusiveness among them, the countries, small countries which are not satisfied that American initiatives are designed only for big actors, but not the small ones. But the small actors, they would like to benefit from different competing projects as well. How you see, as a scholar, as an analyst, how you see the reconciliation of all these contradictions within the format, and especially having Donald Trump back with his concern on China? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a bit of a wait and see right now. I mean, as the other panels discussed, I mean, there's a future where the U.S. is much more aggressively, countering China. Obviously, I think the pick for Secretary of State, Senator Marco Rubio, is indicative of that. Several other cabinet picks, but then at the other end, I think President Trump has this sort of transactional approach, almost business-like in ways. When I talk to folks in Southeast Asia, you often actually hear sort of, we can do business with the President Trump, we can do a transactional approach. Actually, a de-emphasis of values would perhaps be beneficial for some relationships in the global South with the United States, right? But it's a bit of a wait and see. Now, I will say that I think I am optimistic that there'll be a renewed push from the U.S. on some of these infrastructure projects, which have been, where a lot of the benefits in the global south are, and where, frankly, the Quad and the US in particular are a bit behind China. And if you recall, in the first Trump administration, the Development Finance Corporation came into being, and it's been a bit of a slow start. But now we're seeing the DFC really take a leading role in providing some financial backing to big infrastructure projects in the Indo-Pacific, including in partnership with India and Japan, for instance. And I think what we'll see is under Trump there'll be another sort of push on DFC. At least I think there's some anticipation in Washington of that. As well as a private sector approach. If I'm looking at it from a narrowly sort of US perspective, the weakest element of American foreign policy right now in the Indo-Pacific is the economic side. On the security side, I think the US is very well placed. We've improved our relationships with a variety of allies and partners, but on the economic offering, it's been somewhat limited, and that's where China is actually making its biggest gains. Now, then if you're pitching it towards a more, like, say, Southeast Asia perspective, I mean, that for these countries that are hedging, not multi-aligning, this is beneficial, right? They can sort of play off Beijing, Washington, New Delhi, Tokyo. They can go to different partners and receive support for a variety of initiatives. And in many cases, it's not necessarily one or the other, right? Like, just because China puts in a high-speed rail in Indonesia, in Bandung, doesn't mean that the US cannot also, say, pursue critical minerals production, right? I mean, this is, in these countries' perspectives, it's not really necessarily a binary choice. And I don't think it would serve us to approach it from a binary perspective. I think making countries in the global south choose explicitly would actually likely backfire on us and cause more issues. So I think we need to be aware of that and do, I think, what the Quad is starting to do. And that's sort of just say, these are our offerings. Here's our deliverables, right? A good one to point out. These infrastructure and fellowships of the Quad is now funding to help build capacity at a very low level, across the region. Those kinds of initiatives are small, but if you can ramp them up, increase that spending, then that will, I think, bear a lot of weight down the road. Really what it is, it's not making people choose, it's giving them options, and hopefully your option is the better option. If the math works, the financing works, then people will come to you. And I think that's what we need to be doing better, is actually making these pitches. So if I am going to be critical of the Quad, it's one thing is that I think its public goods agenda is very ambitious, but it's quite thin in terms of actual backing, right? It's in the millions. It's not really in the billions yet. I would like to see it receive a lot more support. And whether that's through public-private partnerships, you have to make a private sector case for it. I think that could happen under a Trump administration.
Thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, our panel is coming to its end. But before closing that, I will ask you just to make 3 main recommendations on the cooperation in the field of maritime security. At least none of us just ruled out the importance of the or the future of the Quad. So please feel free just to make your 3 main policy recommendations in that field. Let's start just from Lucas Meyer. Please go ahead. 30 seconds, please, no more.
My 3 recommendations on maritime security. I think the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative is a big deal, but I think more detailed intelligence sharing is actually a benefit to regional countries, especially their coast guards. Number 1. Number 2, I think more funding for Coast Guard initiatives is sorely needed. More delivery of services. And then 3, I think right now Malabar is formally separated from Quad. Even though it's the Quad countries, it's not actually technically part of it. I think, maybe we can take that risk in a Trump administration, to slowly sort of incorporate some more of a traditional security, approach to the Quad. Of course, taking into account some of the differences of opinion, that could be a work in progress. But those are my 3.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. It's your turn. Okay, it's your turn. Your 3 recommendations.
Thank you, Stefan. My 20 seconds I will use to say that maritime security has already been futuristic. It should always be futuristic. And therefore, 3 areas where I want them to keep focus is A, that increasingly threats that the world is facing are coming from natural, not just climate change, but pandemics, of course, or tsunamis and earthquakes and so on. So HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, is something that should continue to be top priority for most of the maritime powers to deal with, where they'll be able to support several large number of nations that are not really having either capacity or wherewithal to deal with some of these challenges. They have responsibility towards them. Second, of course, this whole new challenge about artificial intelligence redefining the way we live. And that is going to redefine also how we understand the challenges when we talk of maritime security, and of course, how we deal with those challenges. And I think one has to be very careful. The revolution that AI is bringing is beyond our imagination. I think that kind of security, maritime security and deliberations should really keep an eye on, keep the focus on this. And third and last, I think there is enormous need of building personal bonhomie and relationship between leaders. And I'm not talking here of national leaders, I'm talking here of naval leaders and who are professionals, and they are at the top of their game in each of these countries. And I think increasing connection between them, and summit diplomacy is already so easy, connection, whether it is travel, transport, or information or communication, is also easy. Strengthen cooperation between naval leaders as much as possible, because once that personal level equations are positive and synergy is built, response to crisis can be much more effective and faster in that sense. So these are a couple of things that I want to underline. As I said, I have 20 seconds and I'm delighted, and I must thank the host and thank my moderator and chair, Stefan, for excellent conduct of this session, following all exactly within time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Dr. Ernest Gunasekara-Rockwell, please, your three main recommendations.
Thank you, Stefan. So I would say, reinforcement of international norms and laws is imperative. If the Quad's gonna mean anything, we really have to kind of push that forward. I would also say security interoperability. Really kind of pushing that return back to quadrilateral security dialogue instead of being a master or jack of all trades, kind of getting back to what we were initially aimed at doing as at least a core function of the organization. And then I would say strategic communication and public diplomacy. It's not enough to just articulate the Quad's objectives. We have to illuminate them, get them out there so that people understand exactly what it is that the organization's about, and where they want to go. And I think that public diplomacy, well executed, can foster regional goodwill while exposing and discrediting adversarial disinformation, which is rampant out there. And I do think that with the advent of AI, as Dr. Singh said, it's going to just become more prolific out there, and thus it's more imperative that we provide that counter narrative that straightens out people's perceptions of the organization and of its member states. And thank you to you and to NICE for this absolutely fantastic panel. Thank you.
Thank you too. Professor Yoichiro, your three recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I draw my three lessons from many other speakers also. I think economy is very important way of engagement, and I think the Quad members really need to quantitatively increase what we have done so far. The privatizing everything is not the solution, especially when it comes to basic infrastructure. There are certain things you need prior to measure development based on private investments. So that's basic infrastructure. The second is the transparency. I think whatever we do will be less effective if there is no transparency. And corruption has been a major obstacle and a window of opportunity for China. So we need to quantitatively get closer to China, but at the same time, we shouldn't play into the Chinese game of this corrupt influence into domestic politics. Third, I think, is inclusivity. And, having said all those bad things about China, I still think China needs to be engaged. And there are ways to engage China. And one example I see is from Cook Island, where the aid was made into a three-way aid relations: China, New Zealand, and Cook Islands. And this brings closer eyes into the conduct of Chinese aid money. In this case, it was the water supply development. And in fact, they did catch some of the really bad practice by China. So this kind of attempt to engage China, I think, is still necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Till, very briefly, already you made your wonderful presentation. So I think you can just sum up three main recommendations. Please do that.
Okay, I've been knocking out my own recommendations as everybody else has already made them, actually. I would emphasize the importance of agility. It seems to me that criminals and people like that are amazingly agile and fertile in the way they're thinking ways round the restrictions on them that we are trying to impose. All organizations compared to criminals are kind of lumbering organizations that are always on the reactive and back foot. I think that is an issue that we need to address. And one thing that does concern me is the lack of is not observing the difference between a declaratory idea of actually all coming together and agreeing that this is what needs to be done without taking it one stage further and getting into the implementation of it, which requires a kind of institutional background and build up that I don't always think is there in some of the things we do. So MDA and everything that will make it effective. It does seem to me that we need to avoid the single simple solution approach. We need to bear in mind that we have to cover the whole spectrum of maritime security. It's not a binary choice of this or that. It's a question of balance between all of them, that all of these approaches are necessary and need to be pursued in a sensitive fashion. Try to avoid the simple, the seduction of a simple solution to any of these problems. The last one is a bit different from anybody else, and I'm sort of inspired by one of the comments that Professor Singh made about the civilizational side of things. It does seem to me that organizations like Quad need to occupy and be seen to occupy the moral high ground in the sense of encouraging countries to obey the rules, whatever the rules are, whether they're UNCLOS regulations, regulations compared to ship safety and that sort of thing that come from IMO, or indeed things like the arraignments of the International Court of Justice and things like that. So I think the Gandhian civilizational approach in Indian strategic thinking over the centuries is something we ought also to take alongside when we're going down the transactional, realistic, pragmatic route as well. We shouldn't forget the moral high ground.
Thank you very much. I just very shortly on my side, I come from a country which is very far distance from this region, and you may think that this small country in very different region is not interested in the development I will be very, very frank with you that Armenia is also looking around and deepening, looking for many opportunities of the diversification of its policy, strengthening the relations with the United States, with Japan, with India. And so Armenia also can be on board as a small country, including that format. So let me thank on my behalf and on behalf of other participants, all of you for this fascinating panel. I really enjoyed it. I apologize for these 7 minutes we just used from the other panel. I hope just to I'm really looking forward to meeting you, to seeing you wherever it may be, and thanking the Nepali Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for giving this opportunity of networking, exchange of views and perspectives. I really satisfied with this panel, and I think other participants also appreciate it. And thank you all of you, all of them, and all the staff standing behind this event. Thank you.